Still live. Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well on this wonderful Tuesday afternoon. The holidays are over. It's a new year. And if you've made any resolutions, congratulations. We are working hard. We are live from Ether headquarters, which is my office in my house. And if you made a resolution to read the Bible more this year or to deepen your understanding on the Bible, then you're welcome, because we're going to be doing these live streams every Tuesday. And we're actually doing this as part of our How to Study the Bible series. We've been talking about biblical genres. And on this live stream, we're going to be talking about the biblical genre of historical narratives, more specifically, historical narratives in the Old Testament. And occasionally, I'm going to be turning my head to put things on the screen. So if you see the side of my face, forgive me, because I'm bringing up things for you to look at. And the first thing is, this is a list of the historical narrative books in the Bible. In case you're curious, this is not an extensive. Well, these are all the historical narratives in the Bible. There are other books that belong on this list that are not fully historical narratives. And what I mean by that is that there's actually very few books that are one genre only. For example, there are some prophetic books that have some historical narratives on them. And there are obviously some historical narratives that have prophecy on them, and so on and so forth. But this, what you're seeing on the screen now, on top of my face, are the books that belong to the genre of historical narrative. And what historical narratives are is basically, historical narratives are a retelling of historical events that gives meaning and direction to the people in the present. And let me clarify that a little bit, because what that means is really the definition. What it means is really the people that are the audience that it was meant for. And I've talked a lot about in recent videos about doing exegesis and understanding that the Bible wasn't necessarily written with us 21st century people in mind, that the Bible had a very specific audience. And so historical narratives were written for a specific audience. And in interpreting the Bible and interpreting historical narratives, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is the fact that we weren't the intended audience. And basically, historical narratives, more specifically in the Bible, were meant to give purpose and direction to the people of Israel. And so in this video, I want to talk about three things that are important to understand when you're reading and interpreting historical narratives. Again, these are not the only things to keep in mind, but we wanted to basically boil it down to three simple things. When we read historical narratives, one of the things that we have to understand is that as time has gone on, genres change, and the way that people make their points and the way that people teach their lessons has changed over the centuries. The way that we read a story now isn't the same way that people read stories before. And as a matter of fact, most historical narratives were not even meant to be read, but they were meant to be heard. And most of the ways that these stories were shared was through people telling stories. And stories are a very effective way for people to remember things, and they're a very effective way to make a point. And so, again, in this live stream, what we're sharing are three things that you need to keep in mind when reading historical narrative. So, the first thing that you need to keep in mind is the fact that historical narratives did not directly teach doctrine. And what I mean by that is that not everything that you read, not all the actions that you see in historical narratives are things that we are meant to adopt as doctrine. I'll give you an example. The book of Judges is the quintessential example of what a historical narrative is supposed to be. And take a character like Gideon, for example, who God tells him that he's going to go fight these people, and he has some doubt, and he basically performs these tests in order to make sure that God is going to give him victory. One of them, for example, is that he lays a fleece out, and if there's dew on it in the morning, then he will know that that's God's confirmation that he will have victory. That, for example, isn't supposed to be a lesson for us on what we are to do if we want to know God's will. There are times that historical narratives do teach doctrine, but it's doctrine that is confirmed as doctrine in other places. Like, for example, when we see the Israelites doing or not doing something that's in the Ten Commandments, for example, like, we know that that's doctrinal, but not because of the historical narrative, but because it's part of the law of the Israelites. I hope that makes sense. And talking about Gideon, this is a perfect segue, because the second thing that you need to know about historical narratives is that the characters in historical narratives are not meant to be good examples. Sometimes they are, and sometimes it's a mixed bag. And for example, again, take the example of Gideon. Gideon, in trying to make God perform all these tests, isn't teaching us what good faithfulness is. If anything, the fact that he's asking over and over and over again for God to confirm that he's going to have victory actually doesn't show that he's faithful. It shows his lack of faith. And again, and we know even like Gideon, after he has all these victories and has all his battles, ends up being somebody who is consumed with his own worship. And so a lot of times when you read these stories, you sort of scratch your head and you wonder, like, are these supposed to be good examples of the kind of people that I'm supposed to be? And the reality is that more often than not, historical narratives give us characters that are flawed. Not completely flawed. Like, for example, take the example of Abraham. Abraham is the father of our faith. And in many ways, he's a great example of faith. Certainly when he was willing to kill his son and knew that somehow God was going to provide. That's a great example of faith. Him leaving his land to go to a promised land is a great example of faith. Him believing that God is going to give him a son is a great example of faith. And at the same time, Abraham is deeply flawed. Like when they're traveling through Egypt, he's afraid that he is going to be hurt by others because his wife is beautiful. And then so he lies and tells that, hey, if somebody asks you, tell them that you're my sister, not my wife. And also we see Abraham doubt at some point, which is why he has Ishmael and sleeps with his one of his servants at the behest of his wife. Abraham was not a perfect character. This idea of sort of the perfect hero is a very modern idea in literature. And oftentimes when we're reading biblical historical narratives, specifically in the Old Testament, and I forgot to mention that, all the things that I'm sharing pertain Old Testament historical narratives, because, for example, the book of Acts is a historical narrative, but it's a little bit of a different one, and it was written way after most of the historical narratives that are in the Old Testament, so some of the style changes there. So everything that I'm sharing now really applies to Old Testament historical narratives. And like I was saying, Abraham is not necessarily always the best example that we're supposed to follow. Yes, his faith is worthy of imitation, but a lot of times other things aren't. So when you're reading historical narratives, keep in mind, more often than not, the characters that are involved in the story are supposed to be examples of what we're not to do instead of examples of what we're supposed to do. The other thing and the last thing that I want to share as far as like things to keep in mind when you're reading historical narratives is that at the end of the day, God is the hero of all historical narratives. I've shared in other videos in the series that the Bible ultimately is about God, and this is specifically important to understand when we're reading historical narratives because the characters involved in these stories are flawed. But in many ways, that is really there to serve as contrast for God. And I'll give you again the example of Abraham or the example of Gideon. Where those characters lack faith, who is shown as extremely faithful is God. Even though Gideon doesn't have the faith that it requires for him to know that he's going to have victory, God again and again is faithful to him and tells him, in spite of his doubt, that he is going to have victory. In spite of Abraham's flaws, God still keeps his promise to do what he tells them that he's going to do. Over and over through historical narratives, we see characters that are flawed, but the character that is perfect and the one that we are supposed to learn about and learn from is God himself. When we understand that, all of the historical narratives make a lot more sense, because the hero, the main character of the historical narratives, are not necessarily the people whose name we know, but it is God. And often, what we learn most in historical narratives isn't necessarily how to behave or not how to behave, but we learn about the character of God. So as you read Genesis and Joshua and Kings and certainly the book of Judges, I think this applies a lot for the book of Judges. Keep these things in mind, that we're not, often these aren't books necessarily to teach doctrine. They're books to really give purpose and direction to the people that are reading it and to figure out how they're supposed to, not even often how they're supposed to live, but like, especially in relation to the people of Israel, who God is the big lesson that we get from a lot of historical narratives. And so again, as you read, keep in mind that not everything that you're reading is meant to be taken as doctrine. Keep in mind that the characters are often not supposed to be good examples, but bad examples. And most certainly keep in mind that God is supposed to be the main character of these stories. And through these stories, what we learn most is about who God is and the kind of God that we're supposed to worship and follow. So hopefully you've enjoyed this live stream. Like I said, you can expect one of these every Tuesday. We are doing other videos, like we're working on other videos that sort of complement the series, and certainly we're still working on our podcast and all that stuff. We're really excited about this year. We're going to do a lot of things, and if you like what we do, please share. Also, if you really like what we do, consider supporting us on Patreon so we can continue to develop this content and to help you learn the Bible. What we try to do here at Ether is to teach and elevate the Bible using digital media. We're working on a lot of content. We're writing articles. We'll have a podcast. We do these videos, and we're able to do it through your support. One of our goals for this year is to try to get to 500 Patreons. So if you want to be one of our first 500 Patreons, please consider going to our Patreon page and becoming one of our Patreons. And thank you so much for watching, and hopefully this has been instructive and inspiring. And if you have any questions, please make sure to leave a comment and subscribe to this, to our page. And if you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.